Good morning. My name is Ole Amundsen, and I'm the Executive Director of KVCOG. Welcome to our third in a series of 4 meetings about our comprehensive economic development strategy for Kennebec and Somerset County, Waldo County. Today, we're going to be talking about data. It's an exciting period of time for planners and demographers with the trickling out of U.S. Census data, and it's almost like Christmas. So it's a wonderful time of gift giving and discovery and all that sort of good stuff. We are really fortunate today to have our state economist, Amanda Rector, here. And Amanda has a deep connection with Maine, having worked for the state since 2004 and being a state economist since 2011. And I'm sure she's no stranger to many of you. And I always find economists to be incredibly useful and impactful. Probably the best teacher I had at Colby was a guy named Tom Feitenberg, who was basically the godfather of environmental economics. And I think Tom's work really kind of proved that economists can kind of lead us in counterintuitive directions and dispel myths and use facts and kind of lead us in ways we wouldn't expect. So I always find the views that economists have to be particularly productive, particularly in a planning role. So I'm very much eager to hear what Amanda has to say about the state of the state and what the census is revealing for us. After Amanda's talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about our next meeting, where we'll be talking about projects. And this is kind of the nuts and the bolts and the special sauce that is of interest to many of you. As many of you know, in CEDS plans, we actually can list specific projects that basically illustrate the larger points of the CEDS plan in terms of regional development. And I'll be crosswalking. As many of you know, the Economic Development Agency has released a whole pile of grants to distribute about $3 billion, that's with a B, over the next year. So I think we can help them with that. And the CEDS plan is one avenue for getting your projects in. But we have some considerations and kind of criteria, for what makes kind of a more effective CEDS project. So I'll talk about that. And then batting cleanup is Will Harper, who's going to basically take a very specific dive into kind of our regional context. So Amanda's going to handle statewide specifics, and Will is going to go into our counties in terms of the detail there. So it should be a fun and exciting morning. I hope everyone is well caffeinated, and we'll get underway. So Amanda, take it away.
Thank you. This is very exciting for me. This is the first time that I've done an in-person presentation in 18 months, I think. It was February of 2020. So this is a good sort of warm-up. Not too many people in the room. I'm not going to feel totally overwhelmed by the...
Was our business practice like the last thing you did? That might have been pretty close. Maybe that's, yeah, I think you did January.
Yeah, I think I had something in February, and then I was supposed to do something in March that was literally canceled like the evening before, kind of, and that was the end of all of it. So I've been doing lots of Zoom presentations. There you go. All right. Okay, 1 second. Down is forward.
Be the next slide.
Okay, great. So I am going to start out with some high-level demographics. We do now have some of the first 2020 decennial data that's been released through redistricting. So the population for the state in 2020, 1,362,359. We're still the 42nd largest state in the country, though. We saw an increase between the 2 decennials of 2.6%, also 42nd among the states, and we're ahead of West Virginia, Mississippi, Illinois, Connecticut, Michigan, Ohio, Wyoming, Pennsylvania. So an interesting mix of states. We've got a New England neighbor in there that we're growing faster than, which is always nice to see. 2019 median age, we don't have the 2020 median age yet. That was not part of the redistricting data that was released. So we've still got 2019, the estimate was 45 years. That's the oldest in the US. We also have the largest percentage of the population age 65 and over of any state in the US. And we have the largest percentage of baby boomers in our population of any state. And we're 9.8% Black, Indigenous, and people of color. That includes Hispanic. That is the lowest percentage in the US. It has improved from 5.6% in 2010. So it's almost doubled, not quite, but it certainly is, it's increasing. It is still quite low compared to most of the other states in the US. If we look at the counties, the decennial census data for the counties, there were 9 counties that gained population from 2010 to 2020. I've highlighted the 3 that are in this region, so Kennebec, Somerset, and Waldo. Kennebec gained population, Somerset lost population, Waldo gained population as well. The 2 counties that really dominated the population growth, Cumberland and York counties, those are the 2 largest, and they had the most gains. There were actually, even though we saw increased population in the state as a whole, there were more counties that lost population between 2010 and 2020 than there were that lost population between 2000 and 2010. And part of this is because of the continued aging of the population. We really are at a statewide level, and in almost all of the counties, completely dependent on migration for population growth. We have more deaths than births each year, and that is really due to the fact that we have so many more baby boomers than other states. Baby boomers, of course, born between 1946 and 1964, beyond childbearing years now. And so if you look at this population pyramid, this is, each of these bars represents the percent of the population in a particular age sex cohort. This is 1950 for Maine. You can see the baby boomers were just starting to be born. So the bottom of this pyramid, the under 5s, very, very wide. Up at the top, not a lot of people living beyond the age of 85 back in 1950. If you move ahead through the decades, 1960, 1970, 1980, you can watch the bulge of the baby boomers in the population moving up through the decades. 2000, this is a particularly interesting one to look at because you can see, so up at the top of the pyramid, life expectancies, of course, have been increasing over time. So there are more people sort of accumulating in the top pyramid. Yes, these are all Maine, yep. And then the bulge in the middle is the baby boomers. So in 2000, they were in sort of prime working age population years. Down towards the bottom, there's sort of a smaller bulge. That's the baby boom echo. Those are the millennials. So it's because there were so many baby boomers, even though birth rates themselves were lower, it still caused another bulge in the population. So 2010, 2019, as I said, we still don't have 2020 age data yet. So 2019 was the last year of estimates that we have. But you'll notice that this bulge is moving further and further into retirement age and up towards the top of the pyramid. So I do population projections every couple of years. The current projections, we just finished them. They're based on 2018 data, so they're already outdated, essentially. That's the way this works. You do projections, but you're lagged on your data sources. So, but it at least gives you an idea of what continuing trend would be based on what we have been seeing on trends up through 2018. So 2023 and then 2028, you'll notice is that 2028 is not that far away. As the baby boomers are continuing to move into those upper age brackets, this pyramid is starting to turn upside down, and we're accumulating more population at the top and less down at the bottom. So that really is a good example of why we are so dependent on migration into the state to grow the population, because we are not growing our population naturally. There has been a lot of talk, particularly over the past year, about, are we going to see a lot of migration stemming from the pandemic? And we people moving into Maine from that. We have seen more out-of-state home buyers. We don't really know that much about them. We know where they come from to some extent, other parts of the country, but we don't know how old they are. We don't know if they're buying primary homes or second homes. We just don't have a sense of sort of who they are, how long they plan on staying. And so we don't really know yet, is this going to be another big surge in migration for Maine like there was back in the back to the land movement, or is this just sort of a temporary little blip and we'll be struggling to attract more people in a year or two as things start to get back to normal. So the chart here, you can see the year-over-year growth, this annual sales and sale price. And then the July 2021 press release from Maine Realtors, there was a 14.7% increase in single-family home sales in June and a 24.5% increase in the sales price. One of the things that has been happening is that the inventory of sales of homes available for sale has been very, very low. And so this is the active listing count. You can see it's started to tip back up a little bit now. We usually do get an upward trend in the summer months that then trails off again. This is the seasonal pattern that you can see those waves in this chart. The gray bar there is the recession period. It was a whopping 2 months long. That was the shortest recession on record and also the steepest recession. So in June 2021, listings were 6 days on market statewide. So it's just an incredibly tight housing market right now, which is why those prices are going up and up and up and up. If we look at the county level data, and again, I highlighted Kennebec, Somerset, and Waldo counties here, you can see what the counts are in terms of, this is June data, number of units sold, the change over the previous year. Kennebec actually saw a bit of a decline in the units sold, but both Somerset and Waldo saw pretty good increases. And then all three of those counties, actually all the counties across the board, saw an increase in the sales price. Waldo County, 47% increase from a year ago in terms of sale price. One of the challenges, of course, is that this is really concerning from a homeownership affordability standpoint. So this comes from Maine Housing. This is the percent of households unable to afford the median home. And so only a handful of counties in 2020 were considered affordable, where the rest of these counties here were all unaffordable. So as I should point out, so Somerset and Kennebec are both in the affordable category, Waldo is not. But as those home prices continue to increase, you'll see more of the green counties moving into the red section.
It's helpful when there's a little yellow button on there. It's always
So civilian labor force overall. So this is one of the reasons why we pay so much attention to demographics. Of course, the population you have dictates your available labor force. So this goes all the way back to 1947 on this chart. You can see this really big increase sort of in the middle of the chart. There were a few things happening there. We had baby boomers aging into their prime working years. We had some pretty good migration into the state of baby boomers, and we had women joining the labor force in much higher numbers than they had previously. Slowed a little bit for a period of time, then hit 2005, and it leveled out, and it's actually started to trend downward in more recent years. So 2020 is that last data point, so you can see a pretty steep decline there. Hopefully some of that last data point decline is temporary, and we'll see it recover as people come back into the labor force. But you can see the demographic trend of the aging population really has been contributing to this slowing labor force growth in the more recent years. If we look at the more recent data in terms of labor force participation rates and the employment to population ratio, so this is, normally we see data that looks like the first section of this, where there are little ups and downs, but it's a pretty steady trend. The recession really wreaked havoc with the data, and so everything's jumping all over the place. It's hard to pick out trends. You can see that labor force participation, particularly last summer, was just up and down and up and down, and a lot of that I think really just had to do with the vast amount of uncertainty that happened from month to month. People didn't know what was going on. Were they able to go out, not able to go out, what was open, what was closed. It's been gradually ticking back up again, but at a pretty slow pace. You can see we're still well below where we were pre-recession. The employment to population ratio is interesting. It's sort of, you can think of it as almost the inverse of the unemployment rate. So it's the percent of the population that is employed. And you see that really sharp decline, really sharp increase in the first month after things started to open up again, and then gradual increases since then. And so the unemployment rate looks flipped the other way around. April of 2020, the official unemployment rate was 9.1%. That was the highest since February of 1977, which is all the way over there on the left. I just use my hands apparently. So even as high as that was, that underrepresented the true unemployment rate because of some issues around the data, because of so many people who left the labor force who would not be considered unemployed. So the Department of Labor has been doing some estimates of what the true unemployment rate would be if you considered the labor force to be what it had been pre-recession, pre-pandemic. So if labor force participation were at February 2020 levels, the unemployment rate in June of 2021 would be 8.4% instead of the official 4.8%. So there's sort of some hidden unemployment in the official numbers. I find it really interesting and helpful to look at some of the not seasonally adjusted monthly employment data. We don't normally look at this because normally we're trying to pinpoint larger trends. But with what has been going on, I think it's been helpful to look at the not seasonally adjusted. You can see we have a very seasonal economy here in Maine. So the summer months are sort of the peak. The winter, the first quarter is the low point. You can see 2018, 2019, a little bit of growth, same pattern, but a little bit higher in 2019 than in 2018. We started out 2020 in great shape, January, February, even higher than 2019. And then a really steep decline, a fairly sharp increase. And we still had some of that seasonal trend, but at a much, much lower level. And you can see this year, which is in the blue, we're following that same trend. We're sort of gradually trying to close that gap with where we were in previous years. But if you consider where we would be if we had seen that 2020 sort of higher level continue, put us up above that gray line there, we still have quite a ways to go. Leisure and hospitality, of course, has really borne the brunt of the effects. And you can see still quite a gap. You can see the really strong seasonal pattern in this particular data set. Retail trade was an interesting one. So retail trade dropped very, very sharply, similar to leisure and hospitality, where everything just closed. And then actually has come pretty much back at this point in time. This is an interesting one because as people have been buying more things online instead of in physical stores, employment in this category actually has been declining a little bit year over year. You'll notice that 2018 was a little bit higher than 2019, which was a little bit higher than those first couple of months of 2020. So at this point, we're pretty much back to where I would expect us to be in employment in retail. Now, that's been uneven. Certainly the larger retail establishments are the ones that have come back more and actually in some cases have staffed up more to help deal with more people doing sort of online purchases from physical stores, some of the sanitation measures. The smaller boutique retailers, particularly those around leisure and hospitality, the ones that are still not back up to full employment. Construction employment, along with all those home sales, there's been quite a boom in construction, as you might imagine. And so this sector has been doing pretty well. There was a bit of a decline, but construction was a sector that didn't really have to do a lot of the same shutdowns as a lot of other sectors. You're outside a lot of the time in that particular field, depending on what kind of construction you're doing. And so that trend pretty much has been right back up, and you can see the 2020 data is back up above where we were pre-pandemic. State and local government, sort of an interesting one. This is a reverse seasonal pattern in some ways. The summer months have the lowest employment, and that's because that includes education. So public education is part of state and local government. So July and August are those low points when the students aren't there, a lot of the staff aren't there as well. And so we saw that same pattern in 2020. You'll notice 2020 is just a little bit below education, specifically on the left-hand side here. But the drop-off started earlier in the year as schools were closing earlier, did not come back up to the same level. It will be interesting to see what happens once we finally start getting some fall data in this particular sector. State and local government, excluding education, much more steady. It's down a little bit, I think it's about 3%, 3.5%, something like that. Hasn't really come up too much more from where it was last year. In terms of looking forward, so the state has a consensus economic forecasting commission. They set the official economic forecast for the state. We use that in our revenue forecast for the state. You can see this is total employment over time. You can see the pre-Great Recession peak all the way over the left. What we thought was a really big decline in employment, gradual growth back up that sort of accelerated the past few years. A really sharp decline in employment between 2019, which was sort of the new peak pre-pandemic, and then the 2020 data. 2021, the forecast is that we're maybe a little bit better than halfway back to that new peak, and then continued growth pretty strong next year, 2022. 2023 gets us back to a new peak employment, and then a couple more years of growth after that, but at a much lower level. And that's because the demographic trend sort of takes hold again, and without seeing a lot more migration into the state, it will be hard for us to continue seeing employment growth increase as that older population is weighing on the labor force. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about personal income. So this is total personal income for the state. It's not household income or individual income. This is sort of a measure that is akin to GDP. If you look at 2019, down at the bottom here, these are the major components of personal income. 2019 is sort of the standard, what that mix looks like. 44% comes from wages and salaries, 21% from personal current transfer receipts. I hate that name. It basically is, what the heck is that supposed to mean? Those are monies that get transferred from a government to an individual. I've got more on that in just a second. 18% dividends, interest, and rent. 11% supplements to wages and salaries. That's the benefit package that goes to the wage and salary. And 7% non-farm providers income. So if you look at the quarters here, if you look at the second quarter of 2020, of course that's April, May, and June, and you think about what was happening last year in April, May, and June, there was a real shift in what those components were. So wages and salaries dropped to just 37%. Transfer receipts increased to 32%. 2020 quarter 3 and quarter 4 were a little bit more like the normal mix, with transfer receipts being just a little bit higher than usual. But then the first quarter of this year, again, 39% wages and salaries, 31% transfer receipts. And a lot of that really is because of the growth in the transfer receipts. So what was going on there? So here's transfer receipts. Yeah, 2019 sort of the standard year. So usually 36% Social Security, 25% Medicare, 19% Medicaid. So you got about 80% or so coming from those three programs. And certainly as our population ages, more people collecting Social Security, Medicare, this becomes a larger share of total personal income. Quarter 2, Social Security only 21%. Now, the people collecting Social Security did not decline. That dollar figure did not go down. But all the way over on the right-hand side there, you'll notice 36% all other personal current transfer receipts, up from 14% sort of normally. That included all of the stimulus checks that went out to individuals, and then the sort of tan line, the next one in from there, unemployment insurance went up from 1% to 16%. So a huge increase in those two categories made the other categories seem like a relatively smaller share because so much money was being pumped in through those last two pieces there. Still remained elevated in Q3 and Q4. You can see unemployment declining a little bit, still higher than it was previously, but much smaller than that sort of initial bump there. And then 2020 Q1, another big tranche of those stimulus checks, that all other became a huge part of the transfer receipts as a whole, which in turn made that transfer receipts a much larger share of the total personal income. I want to touch on GDP briefly. So this is real GDP by industry over time. It's been adjusted for inflation, so you can see sort of the real trends. The largest one there in the middle is finance, insurance, and real estate. That is mostly real estate, and a lot of the reason for that is because of the way that it's accounted for in this measure. Includes things like imputed rent. So if you own your home, what you would be paying yourself to rent your home if you did not own your home. So it's a little hard to compare with some of the other categories. If you look at some of these others, you'll notice trade is another really large category. Most of that is retail trade. Healthcare and social assistance is another large one, and that saw a pretty good decline in 2020. Professional and business services has seen tremendous growth in recent years. In particular, this is an increasingly large part of Maine's economy. All the way at the end is government and government enterprises. As I said earlier, that does include all the public education system. Educational services, which is quite a small one, is just the private education. The biggest decline in 2020, you'll notice, of course, arts, entertainment, recreation, basically leisure and hospitality. Just as employment declined in that sector, GDP declined in that sector as well. But by and large, the declines in GDP, much smaller as a whole than they were back during the Great Recession, as opposed to employment that saw such steep declines in the most recent pandemic recession. And a lot of that is because of those government supports. The previous chart I just showed you with the personal income transfer receipts that helped to boost a lot of spending that otherwise would have been lost with those declines in employment. So this is a completely crazy chart, which is why I haven't included. This is quarterly real GDP percent change from the previous quarter. So normally, let's see if I can use this here. So there's the Great Recession. We thought those were really huge percentage changes at the time, and everything is just completely dwarfed by what we saw during the pandemic. So absolutely massive decline, followed by an absolutely massive increase, a couple more quarters of increase since then. But the thing to keep in mind is that those increases have been built off of a much, much lower base. So you can see we're sort of back up to where we were in terms of current dollar quarterly GDP pre-pandemic. But if that growth trend continued, we still would be below, we're still below where we would have been if that growth trend had continued instead of declining. So there's still a bit of a gap in terms of the GDP, despite all of those tremendous percentage increases. So I think this is my last one. I just wanted to touch on retail sales. And again, these are some percentage increases that as an economist, you just don't see things like a 200% increase all that often. This is the statewide taxable retail sales by category. So the first column there is the percent change from June of 2020 to June of 2021. The next column over is June 2019 to 2021 to give you a better comparison of sort of where we were pre-pandemic and where we are now, and then the 3-month period compared to a year ago. And you can, I mean, just tremendous increases across the board, not just from 1 year ago, but even from 2 years ago. So this has been really helpful in terms of state revenues, because normally what happens in a recession is people immediately stop buying things and services usually keep up okay. Well, our sales tax system in the state really is built on taxing goods, not services. And so with this circumstance where, because there was that additional support from the federal government, that those transfer receipts that helped support spending, and because people couldn't go out and do the kinds of travel, leisure, and hospitality activities that are sort of the service sector side of things, purchases of goods skyrocketed. And so that really played to our sales tax model that we have here, and has helped to support revenues over the course of the pandemic, much, much more than what we originally anticipated when we first met after the start of the pandemic, thinking about what revenues might be. We had no idea that that could possibly be such a thing, because it's so wildly different from what has happened in past recessions. So I'm happy to take questions that anyone has. This is our website. We do publish a monthly indicators report with some of the stuff I just shared, some other stuff that I didn't share, and then my email address. Feel free to reach out to me if you have questions somewhere down the line. Thank you.
Robin, do you have any questions on the chat?
Don't.
Does
Send them
anybody-
into silence.
Does anybody in the room or listening online have any questions for Amanda? Go ahead and unmute yourself and we'll be able to hear you. All right, hearing none. Let me get my.
Scale that to share that.
Great, well, I want to thank Amanda for giving a really great presentation. It's nice to see kind of all those numbers, and the screen, you seem to have been able to capture the pandemic and the recovery, and it's a very interesting trajectory that you're showing the state to be on. And I think that's going to be pretty compelling for future investments that people are making. We do have someone here from the firm level, the head of finance from Go Labs, which is again, I'm sure she was looking and listening very carefully on workforce planning and things like that. So there are lots of good things. John?
Yeah, and what's your sense of, the transfer receipts, and we saw that infusion of government money. At some point, that is going to level off.
Right.
And obviously, that is, I think, help precipitate inflation to levels that are ridiculous. At some point, that all has to kind of, once this will crash, but it all kind of has to level off. What's your sense of how and when?
Yeah,
I'm sure you guys talk about it at the
issue-
CDFC.
Yeah, the inflation issue is a particularly challenging one, trying to, and there are much brighter minds than mine that have been grappling with this, particularly at the Federal Reserve, because it is, trying to parse out how much of inflation is being driven by some of these sort of really temporary things. Supply chain issues. Supply chain issues usually are pretty short-lived. That we had a lot of things that were affecting the supply chain because of the pandemic, But then we also had a bunch of things affecting the supply chain that were completely unrelated to the pandemic, and were things like weather and, you know, other issues. But there are also, you know, there has been tremendous demand. There is a lot of savings sitting out there at the higher income levels that could potentially help support demand down the line, even through inflation, just because there is so much at the higher income levels. You know, I think that the timing of it, there's still, you know, it felt, even just maybe a month ago, it felt like we sort of knew what the path forward was, and now things have again changed so rapidly because of the Delta variant. Things are shifting again. It's sort of a reminder, oh yeah, we're still in a pandemic and we still don't really know what the final path and trajectory is. It's, you know, it seems at this point that the government infusions of money are likely to be coming to an end. Certainly the enhanced unemployment benefit ends, I think, September 4th. That hasn't been, a lot of people were asking, well, has that been playing a factor in terms of people not coming into the labor force? There have been a couple studies that have said, nah, that's not really where it's coming from. I suspect a lot of the labor force issues have been coming from people who retired earlier than they were earlier expecting to. I think that that's, particularly in Maine, probably playing
What the stock market is doing. I mean, and
right.
look at their portfolio and say,
Right.
I'm done.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, do I really want to go back out into the workforce in a pandemic, or do I want to just, you know, take my investments and call it good?
But you're not leaving the revolving loan committee, so you'll be there for life. That's no getting out of that.
So I do think that there's still a lot of uncertainty, and there are still a lot of moving pieces in terms of how do the supply chain issues work themselves out, including within that these labor force issues, because that has been one of the things driving up wages, is the fact that you can find anybody to hire. So I mean, basic economics, what do you do if you can't find enough people to hire? You offer more money. And so that's been, I think, one of the factors. I think that if I knew what that trajectory would be, I probably would not be sitting here. I'd be off investing and making lots of money. I think our guess is that the Fed is hopefully going to be paying close enough attention to this to know when they need to start raising inflation before raising rates, before inflation gets out of hand. It's always a gamble. You know, they do their best, but they don't have a great answer. That's the best I can give you.
Obviously, it's probably a subject that you guys discussed, orgasm.
Yeah.
Who knows, the government could decide 6 months from now that they want to continue.
I am eager to see what happens on September 5th. If there is, I mean, honestly, I've read some stuff that indicates, well, there aren't that many people getting the extra 300, and that's not really what this is. I hope everybody's wrong. My businesses really need employees.
Yeah.
That's bad.
I think so. There's so many different pieces. I think, you know, there are, I could easily count probably a half dozen different things that are contributing to the lack of available workers right now. And having any one of those half dozen would be problematic. Having all of them at the same time is really devastating to businesses that are trying to hire people.
I think the pandemic also, people got out of their comfort zone, I think, being in the same industry. Because I think there's a ton of people from retail, hospitality industry who just said, and then I'm not going back. I'll do something else. I'm not doing it.
I think that's a big part of it. I think there are a lot of people who sort of took this as a chance to reevaluate and say, is this what I really want to do? I don't think it is.
And all the retraining that DOL offered while they were getting this extra, like free college courses.
And it's coming at a time when there is all of that pent up demand for leisure and hospitality services that, you know, nobody could go out and travel or go to restaurants last year. So they really, really want to do it this year. And the businesses that had hoped that it would be a great move for them found that they just couldn't hire enough people to keep up with it. So it's been a whole different level of challenging this year that wasn't really anticipated.
So Amanda has given us a chapter in the story of the pandemic, but it's unfortunately not the final chapter, which we were hoping that for was the writing was on the wall and we'd all have a kind of a clear path forward, but this has been very helpful. I'm going to pivot now, and we're going to take about 5 minutes to talk about the next meeting and kind of the planning for that. As folks know, this is a series of meetings around our comprehensive economic development strategy. And part of that is actually listing projects that contribute to kind of our region's growth. Concurrently to our revising this plan, EDA has released a series of grants, which coincidentally are linked to your CEDS plan. So we'll talk a little bit about how the CEDS plan is important to these applications because it's a big tangential thing. But our next meeting is going to be in mid-October, October 14th. It's going to be here. It could be all in person or hybrid or totally Zoom. Who knows? But it will be on the 14th in the morning. We'll be doing something. We're hoping that it's at least hybrid. Because we all like donuts, so that's okay. The CEDS plan is really what I would say it's the nexus for EDA between kind of the different economic development districts at the regional level and for Washington DC's kind of funding priorities. And so this plan very much kind of connects the regional and local level projects up to kind of these greater aspirational things. What makes for a good, CEDS planning project, it's one that basically addresses a lot of the priorities at the high level that are listed both for EDA as well as for the actual plan. At last meeting, we went and did a strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities analysis. So projects that match up against kind of tactical weaknesses or are examples of opportunities. For example, things like broadband is probably a great CEDS priority, and we should probably have some broadband projects in our CEDS plan. Shocking. So those are some of those. I have talked with Alan Brigham, who is our regional district EDA rep, and many of you know him because of his longstanding ties to Maine, and he lives in Maine. And we have an excellent, he's the person who goes to bat for you at the regional office for CEDS projects. And so we're very, very lucky. And, it used to be that basically the CEDS plan would be a 3-ring binder with lots of projects listed in it. But EDA wanted to steer away from that and have it be a little bit more selective. But there's a big gray area in terms of this. There's not like a criteria that says like you can't have this project in it. So it's really kind of left up to folks. And so Alan describes it this way, you want to be choosy with the projects that are in there. But at the same time, you want to be flexible. And Alan did mention that you can edit or amend a CEDS plan to actually add projects in. So, the picture, on the right there shows the Trafton Road exit. That is a CEDS plan project. And
And Kim and I talk about being here like 20 years in Middlestrom. That was discussed 20 years ago.
Oh, I know.
It's not now, Ross.
That was chosen for a reason, because I knew you guys would be here and would just like solicit, but more.
They should have named it the
That's right. Well, there's still time. So next slide, please. So, what makes, in terms of how we're going to be thinking about, what goes into a CEDS plan as far as specific projects. Again, First Park is another project that is listed in our current plan. I think we want projects that are regionally focused, that benefit more than one municipality. I know that EDA funds a ton of individual community infrastructure projects, but I think if we have projects that speak to having a regional benefit, that show partnership, heaven forbid a project between Fairfield and Waterville, that would be wonderful, as opposed to just Waterville or just Fairfield. So that's my planner regional hat role. So when you think about bringing projects in October, think about a project that has, benefits more than one municipality. Can this project leverage additional resources? The new EDA grants, the traditional EDA used to require a 50% match. These ones are 80% federal funding. 80% federal funding. That's how they're going to distribute $3 billion. But it's a great opportunity. But you still need 20%. And guess what? If you provide a little bit more, are they going to, the feds going to say no? No, they're going to say, oh, wow, that's really encouraging. We're great. You're stretching our dollars. So talking about leverage is good. Alan specifically mentioned, is there public and political will behind this project? And showing with letters of support from different stakeholders, from elected officials that have been talked to, is really important. It really makes it real. And then, there are these different aspirational qualities at different kind of levels. Within our CEDS plan, we talk about 6 different drivers of success. So that's asset-based cluster development, entrepreneurship and innovation, education and workforce, access to capital, infrastructure and environment, and leadership. These are all kind of like the special sauce of kind of things that we either areas where we want to move the needle or key ingredients. So speaking in kind of pitching your proposal, speaking to those things, using that language, it's like a grant application. You use the language that the grant foundation wants you to use, and those things you should be talking about. EDA also has their own investment priorities, and they are really emphasizing underscore equity, social, economic, environmental equity is probably their #1 goal. And then there are other ones, such as resiliency and recovery, workforce development, manufacturing, technology-based economic development, and then the role of either exports or enhanced foreign investment. So again, having projects speak, to these different things. One thing that Robin has been very good at is we'll be reconvening, the Kennebec Diversity Initiative around workforce development. Guess what, folks? That's a conversation about equity, and the degree that we can fold that in to EDA proposals helps us, but it's also how we speak to that, because as Amanda pointed out, the way the rest of the country looks at equity, we don't really have the same levels of diversity, but we have to show that we're being proactive and kind of really making a case that we're a welcoming place. And so this is how we can kind of take that weakness and turn it into a strength. Next slide, please. So this is kind of the snapshot of the 6 different, pots of money. And in August, just when I went on vacation, of course, they started having webinars on that. So we all know there's no such thing as vacation. And what's, being on an island in Maine without watching a webinar, I would feel just like that I was wasting my time on this island if I wasn't tuned into to webinars. The ones that are most, I think specific, for our region, as well as what we can achieve, is the Build Back Better Regional Challenge. This is a really interesting one, where you can make a proposal where you can fund 3 to 8 projects all at once. This is for a regional level. So imagine if you're Austin, Texas, and you've been looking at semiconductor, shortage, and you say, hey, we're going to put our money down. We are going to become a world dominator in semiconductors. We're going to lure, 3 or 4 companies to come here. We're going to fund major research, with our universities, and we're going to put this all together. I'm sure that's going to happen in places like the Research Triangle Park, Austin, Texas. Well, what can we do? And I'll be convening a group of economic development professionals on Friday, with the different cities in our region and different and folks like Kristen Savage, to just think about how as a region can we, Somerset and Kennebec County, position for this, and make a good application. The other one in here is the Economic Adjustment Assistance Program. This is more like traditional EDA building and construction grants, but just pumped up in terms of a lot more money. And so that's that one. Finally, we've got travel and outdoor recreation and tourism, which is a lot of, again, around what it says up there. I know Robin has been attending a lot of these sessions. Are there other things that you would comment on these different programs?
I think you've covered a lot of the most important things to remember. I would just also add that when looking at the EDA's investment priorities, we can also look at their funding trends. And in the EDA's CARES Act funding that they have also funded my position at Wills, you can kind of see like what they are trying to prioritize in terms of projects, injecting resiliency into everything. And just as a side note, the economic adjustment assistance is the most flexible of these opportunities because they can accept sort of like that justification in a wide variety of areas. So if you can link it to resilience, if you can link it to any one of these things, workforce development, like regional recovery, those are some really great things in there.
So next slide. So again, with these different grant opportunities, these are open to towns, to nonprofits, colleges and universities to apply for. Groups like KVCOG can also apply, but all of them require the projects to be consistent with the current comprehensive plan. So I imagine we'll be getting a lot of calls from different folks to send us the revised plan and when I view consistent, it doesn't mean that the actual project necessarily has to be in there, but you have to speak to how this project applies to the kind of the drivers of success the SEDS plan meets, how it implements it kind of in spirit. That's my own interpretation. I haven't talked to Alan directly about that, but when I see this in kind of grant making thing, it doesn't say required. If it was required, it does say it's required, but consistent is that sort of language. And your proposal probably should kind of discuss, how that, the SEDS plan is achieved by your project, et cetera. And again, including letters of support from the organization that prepared the SEDS plan. And that means us. So I think a lot of people will be calling and ask, can you send me a letter of support? And I will say, are you from a member community? Oh no, well, maybe you should send us a check. I won't say that now. But I think there will be a lot of people who suddenly have this newfound love or appreciation or sudden need for KVCOG. So these letters of support. Again, this is going to be a great opportunity. A 20% match. The Build Back Better one has the first application, and that's actually due in mid-October. So it is like the gun has already gone off. The swimmers have launched off the blocks and hit the water. Whatever metaphor you want, it's going to be quick, and we've got to be just on it. The other ones have more staggered deadlines going through December, January, March, et cetera. But it is going to be a really, really busy period in terms of grant writing, I think. Again, on Friday, I'll be talking with economic development professionals about kind of our Build Back Better proposals. If you are interested in participating in that call, send me your email and I'll add you to the Zoom. Happy to do it. Again, Garvin is going. So, yeah, there we go. And then in terms of our next meeting in October, we will probably distribute basically a one-page kind of, we'll call it application, but just description of projects. And you can put in, your project there. And this meeting, we're going to be pretty open, and we're going to talk about these different projects. How does this project illustrate these set of priorities, et cetera. And I want to have it be a more informal discussion. So now I'm going to be. So any questions on the next meeting and the grant priorities? Yes, Will.
Sure, I have a comment. Well, so when we're thinking about CEDS projects, also remember there are other granting agencies that we can be working with, USDA Rural Development, Northern Border Region Commission, lots of state agencies. So in addition to thinking about the Economic Development Administration, if you have projects that maybe don't fit the purview of what we just talked about, reach out and we can find some funding that might be more appropriate or might be more available. There are, I think, a few other federal and state agencies that are going to be seeing a not comparable but similar push in funding over the next year or so.
Yes. Now, one of the biggest things in existing grant pools are always grant programs. They basically get larger when you have a large federal initiative because it's easier to increase an existing grant program than design one from scratch. And so all the usual things, I'm sure they're all going to have more money and an unlimited amount of time to spend that money. So being prepared is good. Any questions from online, Robin? Any more thoughts from you, Robin, as far as what makes for a good application or things like that?
No, I actually was thinking along the same lines as Will, if you can find other funding sources, in addition to looking at the match. There is a provision with some of these EDA grants that if we can demonstrate certain economic distress related to the pandemic or related to other conditions in the region, that we might get an award with, say, a 10% match, for example. So there's some in there.
All right, so Will, you're up.
All right. Hopefully everybody can hear me well. We're using our meeting owl so that you can see the room in panorama, but you can also see me a little bit better. So my name is Will. I work for KVCOG. I'm employed as a Community Resilience Coordinator. My background is in planning, and I'm really fond of data, so that's what I'm here to talk about today. The region that we're talking about is Somerset County, Kennebec County, and parts of Waldo County. So we're talking about all three counties simply because it's really hard to find that one part of Waldo County that represents where we work. So this designation is our Economic Development District. That was a designation made by the Economic Development Administration. I'm not sure about the logic of it, but I can tell you that Waldo County is split between 3 different EDDs. So we're talking about our 3 counties. We're not trying to make a call for subsuming control over economic development in Waldo County. Some of the data sources that I use today include data from the census, from the Economic Development Administration, Housing and Urban Development Bureau of Labor Statistics. I wanted to use some of these acronyms because sometimes it can be a little bit of a word soup. So ACA is the American Community, or ACS is the American Community Survey, which is a product from the US Census. I use that quite extensively. I also use data from CWRI, which is the Center for Workforce Research and Information, which is part of the Maine Department of Labor. I also use data from Amanda Rector here. So if anybody has any questions about where I got data, when I got data, and how I used it, please feel free to reach out to me. The first thing that I wanted to talk about is population. That's something that Amanda went into a lot of detail. This animation on the left, you'll see total population, on the right, percent change in population. So there are a few things that you can note. First, that population in southern and central Maine is generally growing, and that population in some of the northern and eastern parts of the state is shrinking. The thing to note in the animation on the right is that the percent changes do change really dramatically towards the end of that data set. So in the last 3 or 4 years, we have seen more people moving to the state in some places. Other places, not as much. The other thing to note is between some of the decades, there's big jumps in population, and that's more of a error in methodology. A lot of these population estimates are based on what are called intercensal population estimates, so they're between the census estimates, they're not as accurate, so when we get more rigorous data for the 2020 census, we can expect this to change as well. Population change, Amanda went over this pretty succinctly. The population change in the 1990s was different from the 2000s, was different from the 2010s, and is different from the last 5 years. In Maine, it was a 9.7% increase overall. Looking at each county individually, you can see that the rates of change were also different. So Kennebec County saw something of a decrease in the 90s, but then a general increase, sort of like the state. Somerset County is all over the map. My expectation is that this is also due to the methodological errors in calculating and estimating population. However, the county overall hasn't seen much of an increase, but it has seen an increase over the last 30 years. And then in Waldo County, it's something of a different story. This has been a pretty steady and unequivocal increase in population. Looking at this on the map, we can see that in the last 30 years, there's something of a pattern here. So the larger cities and towns, Gardiner, Augusta, Waterville, Skowhegan, have lost population in the last 30 years. Looking at the percent change on the right, that sort of follows that corridor of those populated places up through Carrollton and Jackman. What's interesting as well is seeing the population increases in some of those areas surrounding. So some of the suburbs and exurban places around these towns and cities have seen population increases. The biggest losers in terms of population, Augusta, Gardiner, Waterville, Skowhegan. The biggest gains in population, Vassalboro, Litchfield, and Sydney. Those are the total population change rather than the percent change. In some instances, it might be more compelling to look at, for example, a town of 1,000 people that gained 100 residents versus the town of, say, 30,000 people losing 1,000 residents. So it's a very different story than what it looks like on the ground. Just looking in the last decade, we can see these similar trends, except for one interesting blip, which is that Waterville has actually seen a population increase just in the last 10 years. Again, you can see Waterville has gained 85 people. However, with the 2020 census information, we may expect to see different figures. Looking in the last 5 years, the overall population trends have sort of leveled out, and it's more consistent that we're seeing population growth in Kennebec County and parts of southern Somerset County. And again, on the right, the percent changes show that there's been a positive increase in population in lots of places and a negative decrease in population in some of the more rural spaces. Looking at population density, it's a similar story. So we see some of these areas around Augusta, Waterville, and Skowhegan that have increased in population density. But the thing to keep in mind here is that population density, if you have 5 people living in unincorporated territory, and you see 5 more people move there, that's a huge increase in population density, but not really a big increase in population. Looking at the components, Amanda touched on the difference between natural population change and immigration and migration. Over the last 10 years, we've seen kind of consistent trends in terms of natural growth in the counties, generally more deaths than births. The trends for migration, especially international migration, have changed quite a bit. From Kennebec County to Somerset County, for example, there are far fewer people immigrating to Somerset County. Just looking in the last 5 years, those numbers have changed really considerably. So looking again from 2010 to 2020, and then from 2015 to 2020, there's been a big change. Part of that is political, part of that is pandemic, but it's something that we should be keeping our eye on because, as Amanda pointed out, a lot of our population growth is tied to migration and immigration. Looking at the population distribution, the number of people between the age of 18 and 65, across the United States, it's about 61.7% of the population. Here in Maine, 61.1, and in the counties, it's fairly similar. It's not too radically different. However, the thing to keep in mind here is that one spike in population in that cohort 65 to 74 is a really considerable number of people. So this is a more condensed version of the data that Amanda was showing, and I did that in order to show some of the county information, which was available at a sort of less aggregated or a more aggregated data set. So looking at that, we can see that there are a lot of people who are just on the cusp of retiring, whose participation in the labor force may sort of hinge on finding work that is appropriate for them or is even appealing to them. And so one of the things that I'm really curious about is all of the folks who are in the labor force who maybe exited, as we talked about, who retired early, who went back to school, who are maybe not interested in working the jobs they had previously, and whether and how long it takes them to re-enter the workforce, I think is a big question. Looking forward, these are the same figures that Amanda was showing in terms of population estimates for the future. The big changes that we're seeing are sort of in line with what we saw in the last 5 to 10 years. Still, Augusta, Winslow, Gardiner are expected to lose population. Waterville, Sydney, Oakland, Fairfield, some of the places that are sort of around those areas are expecting to see population increases. Again, this may change with the census, and there's no such thing as a for-sure prediction of the future, but it's still a really important thing, especially when thinking about CEDS plans, when thinking about local planning and economic development. What is your town expecting? And not necessarily thinking about it as sort of written in the sand, but asking yourselves and your community the question of, what do we want to see this community look like in 5 to 10 years? And what do we actually have control over that we can leverage, that we can influence in order to achieve that? Population growth and decrease is certainly one of those things that we might not have as much control over, but it's something that we can influence. Race and ethnicity, again, Amanda touched on this. The counties are very much in line with Maine. However, as Amanda pointed out, there has been something of a increase in diversity, showing a decrease in the percent of the population that is exclusively white. Not a remarkable change since the 2014 ACS 5-year estimate, but still a step in the right direction in terms of racial and ethnic diversity. Looking at employment and unemployment, we saw huge changes in employment, unemployment, and the unemployment rate in the last year and a half. On the left, you see the state of Maine. Above, it's the civilian labor force and employment. On the right, it's county level data. Looking at Somerset County and Waldo County, we see very similar trends. However, the overall change in the unemployment rate is much higher in Somerset County than it is in Kennebec or Waldo counties. The labor force participation rate in the state of Maine, again, we saw this in detail in Amanda's presentation, huge decreases in people participating in that labor force. Looking back, however, at the American Community Survey estimates from 2019, for Kennebec County, Somerset County, and Waldo County, we can see that in general, they have lower labor force participation rates than the state as a whole. This might be part of our conversation about generation, about people retiring, but it's certainly something that we'll be measuring again in the future. And then hopefully the unemployment rates that we see will continue to decrease and return to some of the sort of pre-pandemic levels. 3.1% was a pretty remarkable low in that sense. Moving on to occupations and work. Some of these things are sort of no-nonsense conclusions. For example, there are more people working in natural resource industries in Somerset County than, say, Kennebec County. And there are more people working in, say, sales positions in Kennebec County, Somerset County. It's a really important part of our discussion of how we do economic development, looking at where people work and what the economy looks like as a whole. The number of establishments, and this is data that's for all of Kennebec, Somerset, and Waldo County combined. The biggest contributors to the number of establishments are retail, trade, construction, healthcare, professional, technical services. Looking at employment and jobs, healthcare and social assistance are way out ahead. 19.6% of jobs are in this category. And then again, retail, education services, public administration, manufacturing also make a presence. Healthcare, again, is really high in terms of wages and earnings in all of these positions. Some of these jobs may have lower wages, and so we see here that things like accommodation and food services really only represent 2.7% of all wages and earnings. However, they represent 6.2% of employment and jobs and 7.3% of establishments. And so there's a big difference in terms of what employees in those businesses are earning and contributing to the economy. Looking at all of these with respect to how they compare to state wages, real estate, utilities, and management firms tend to have higher than average wages, and pretty much everything else tends to have lower than average wages. And again, these are average numbers, and these are aggregated for the 3 counties, but it's still worthwhile to examine this when we're talking about building jobs, building our economy, and looking at which jobs actually have higher wages and more desirable sort of perks. Looking at some of the changes that have happened over the last 10 years, we can see that there is a big change just in the last year between 2019 and 2020 in things like accommodation and food services. We've already explored this. However, I'm really compelled by some of these big increases between 2010 and 2020 between transportation, warehousing, real estate, management firms, and even other services except for public administration. I'm not sure exactly what all of that includes, but those are really remarkable increases. Looking at data from the CEDR, the Center for Business and Economic Research based out of USM, they have sort of projections on some of these industries sort of during and post-pandemic up to 2025. They're, I think, pointing out quite rightly these huge decreases in arts and entertainment and accommodation. And these changes are generally going to be sharp in the short term, and then not really recovering to that full pre-pandemic level, 2019 level. Some other industries, so management, we see increases in education and healthcare services. Again, these are predictions for the future, but looking at this in the short term will help us plan strategically about where we're focusing our efforts. Employment, they're expecting to see a slow recovery, but not quite to 2019 levels. This might be different from the data that Amanda was showing. Personal income expected to increase after that sort of sharp decrease in 2020. Gross domestic product, again, Amanda talked about this as being generally increasing and returning to pre-pandemic levels, and then wages and salaries also increasing. So generally positive, looking at some of the shifts in industries may be where we're focusing our efforts. One thing that I really wanted to share, which I think is interesting, is looking at the consumer price index. This tries to get a gauge on how much we spend on things. The graph on top shows all items, and it's all over. And I highlighted sort of the recession during the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis, where you can see just a huge spike and then a decrease as percent change from the previous year. However, looking at where we are in terms of the pandemic currently, on the bottom, we can see so this is all items less food and energy. Food and energy tend to be really volatile, so they increase and decrease. Looking at all items, we can see that it was actually fairly steady for a considerable amount of time, and then a sharp spike. And then looking at, these are commodities. These are the things that our economy is driven by, things that we buy at stores, huge increase in commodity prices. Some of this, as Amanda talked about, might be due to supply chains, it might be due to worker shortages, but that's something that we'll keep our eye on in the state of Maine. Shifting a little bit, income in the state of Maine. We've seen generally positive increases. This is something that was mentioned in our previous CEDS plan as being one of the main targets. Something worth noting is that Somerset County generally lags behind the other counties in the state in terms of median household income as well as per capita income. However, distribution for the state, we're talking about how many people earn $10,000 or $15,000 or $50,000. That distribution is generally consistent between all 3 counties. I thought that was really compelling. Something that you would expect to see in some areas where there are, for example, more wealthy people and more poor people. When we talk about the sort of deterioration of the middle class, you would expect to see that in distribution, and it's just not as visible in the 2019 ACS data. Poverty rates in our region are something that we do need to pay attention to. Again, Somerset County tends to be ahead of the region, and it was actually the only county in this sample that saw an increase in poverty rates. Mapped on the left, you'll see every county subdivision, so municipality or an unincorporated territory that had high poverty rates highlighted in brown. The white area you see in the upper northwest corner didn't have enough population to provide any data. But again, in some of these rural places, if we're talking about a population of 100 people and 10 of those people fall into this category, that may increase the poverty rate more so than we would see in some of the more populated areas. Still, this is something we pay attention to both with respect to economic development, but also with respect to applying for grants. So certain grant programs like the community development block grants, those are sort of keyed into communities that meet these criteria of having poverty. And so comparing the state of Maine to the rest of the country in New England, New England in general, we're pretty much in line with. Compared to New Hampshire, we have a higher poverty rate. Compared to Massachusetts, we have the same poverty rate. And so definitely something we need to pay attention to. This isn't something where we're doing better than our neighbors, we're doing well. This is something we should address regardless. Shifting again to educational attainment, we've seen pretty interesting increases in the number of people who have a bachelor's degree. My guess is that part of this trend is due to generational shifts, and it's due to a sort of broader trend of people getting higher education degrees.
That was a CEDS goal too, wasn't it?
Yes,
Yes.
very much so.
Yes, all throughout, I'm trying to touch on some of the things that were established as goals, while also keeping in mind some of the things that we may have missed. And there are also some things that maybe weren't as remarkable as we had thought. But this is something that we should be really pleased about. It's also something we should be paying attention to. As I mentioned, people exiting the workforce during the pandemic, some of those may be going back to college and thinking about how we can support them if they're doing a career shift, if they're retraining. That's going to be a component to economic development that we'll definitely have a part in. Somerset County and Waldo County each have somewhat similar profiles. However, Somerset County generally has fewer college-educated residents, and Waldo County has slightly more. But overall, positive trends. Gesundheit. So that does it for me for now. I want to leave some time for any questions or comments. Any from the room or from online, please go ahead and ask.
Well, I thought there was a method to your madness of you know, again, crosswalking your analysis with, again, one of the things that you've done in the first CEDS meeting was basically talk about how we've achieved the visions of the past CEDS plans. And a lot of the past CEDS plans, goals were demographic goals. We wanted to see an increase in population. But we all know that, KVCOG, believe it or not, does not control population. But we generally, you need to have people if you want to have employees and things like that. And so I think Will had done a very good job in kind of crosswalking, how we've done. And this is really kind of more of an analysis about where we're going.
I was surprised that the healthcare wasn't higher.
Yeah.
For years, we've been saying, 30% of Maine's population is in healthcare or health-related services. Is that even still true? I mean, it seems it should be growing with everybody getting home.
We're aligned to those slides.
Yes, it is a big part of employment, and it had been growing. The growth has slowed a little bit over recent years. Some of the most robust growth has been coming from professional and business services, but healthcare certainly is a big piece.
Yeah, it's a big component of our economy now. It's certainly a big contributor to wages. And we see here, so healthcare is sort of 5 up from the bottom, generally positive and increasing. That isn't the case with every single sector, but also when we're talking about, for example, healthcare in terms of number of jobs, number of establishments, it's really high. So a 1.2% increase in industry that has so many businesses, that might actually be a considerable, a 1.2% increase in an industry that has like 20,000 establishments. that might actually be a more remarkable increase than say a 10% increase in an industry that has none. So comparing that to, for example, marijuana sales versus healthcare, I still think healthcare is probably going to contribute much more to the economy overall in terms of jobs and wages and things like that.
So for example, it would be interesting to sort of see, we did have, the head of finance for Go Labs, here, that's 100 jobs. We just approved a loan to a plywood plant, hopefully in Bingham. That's another 90 to 100 jobs. How do you think that will affect, if you took those two things, manufacturing, that's going to be 200 jobs in Somerset County is going to be a big change just with those two players. Would you say that that's true?
Oh,
because of the
absolutely.
relatively small numbers that are there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing to keep in mind too is that for a person getting a job at a Go Labs, they're less concerned about whether 100 jobs at Go Labs is going to contribute significantly to NAICS codes that we can use to put in presentations. They're much more interested in meaningful employment, gainful employment, and employment that will be sort of stable over the future. And so I think keeping in mind that we're not just sort of trying to pump up numbers, we're trying to create quality jobs. That I think is an important reminder for what we're talking about when we talk about school. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you tell the story between some of the data points that I saw, that personal income and wages were increased, but employment is not expected to return to pre-pandemic levels?
This is the slide you were talking about?
It could have been, yes.
Yeah. So these are estimates from CDER. My understanding is that these came out last December. And so when you're doing any sort of economic or demographic modeling, you're using a lot of inputs. And I'm not even sure, CDER I think uses a bunch of different software that's sort of third-party proprietary software. Amanda, maybe you can speak a little bit more to sort of how to define and how to interpret projections.
Yeah, so I suspect in this case, and I'm not entirely, I know Brian does the projections here, but I'm not as familiar with the methodology he's using. I suspect that some of what you are seeing is a change in the mix of employment. If you think about a lot of the employment that we lost, it was at the low end, like in terms of the wage spectrum. And if you look at sort of the middle and higher wage jobs, those have held up and in fact expanded. When you add in the fact that we've seen a lot of upward wage pressure at the low end because of the lack of people to fill those positions, I think that's where you see this wage and salary increase coming in faster than this employment where it sort of just levels out. I mean, if you, I didn't include it here, the Consensus Economic Forecasting Commission's forecast for wage and salaries ends up, it does not sort of continue growing at the same rate that this one does. It sort of levels out, and they've leveled it out. It's a little bit higher than the employment growth that levels out, but it's tied to the same thing where essentially, if you're not adding more people to the payrolls, your wage and salary growth is coming from within your existing workforce. And so you're essentially seeing whatever upward pressure is happening within that existing structure.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but those estimates are based on the entire state. They did these projections based on our economic development district. So it's also possible that some of the uncertainty that we get, for example, in census estimates, is also sort of involved in some of these projections. When you're working with rural counties, we might not have as much data as we need to make as certain predictions for the future.
Would you say that this relationship also ties into that increase in commodity expenditures over the last 18 months, with a lot of folks having, more income?
My guess is that they're tied together. I'm not sure how to interpret sort of increases and decreases in consumer goods as compared to like broader, future economic trends. I think that's much more Amanda's territory. No.
Any questions in the chat?
I was writing some. I don't see any, one comment from Courtney, super informative, thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Courtney. I'll see you in 5 minutes.
All right, well, maybe we'll achieve one of our unstated said goals, which is maybe finishing on time. So that would be great, wouldn't it? So thank you all for attending and spending the morning with us thinking about demographics and economics. Again, next meeting will be in mid-October. We'll get you information of kind of a project sheet, and that'll be our project meeting. The meeting everyone has been waiting for, that's why it's the last one. So that's the candy I've been dangling out there. So that'll be hopefully here, hopefully in person. And if you have any questions, send us a note. Again, reminder for folks who are interested in the Build Back Better grant kind of brainstorming session, that'll be this Friday as well. So just send me a note if you want to be added to that soon. Thank you, Amanda, for coming out. We're happy to provide you with your first hybrid meeting, and that was a success, right?
Yes.
Very good. Well, you showed no awkwardness or like, oh my God, who are these people? And you're not.
I used to just
I can't hit mute. I can't hit mute when Lula tries to talk, etc. So we're happy to make that this opportunity. Not the last time you'll be at KVCOG. Okay. Well, thank you all, and have a productive Wednesday.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody participating online has any thoughts about how the hybrid meeting went for you?
Oh, you guys do a great job with that. And I'll tell you, it's nice to see the meeting room that we've been in so many meetings, even though we're not all in the room. It's nice to even see the room and know that there are donuts there.
Thank you so much, Jean.
Yeah, thank you. Great job.
All right, well, everybody, thank you. Have a great day, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you.